All right, thanks everyone for joining us. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. We're going to wait for folks to enter into the room. Wonderful. We've got quite a crowd here today. Thank you so much. I just wanted to start off and talk a little bit about the logistics. So we're going to go ahead and have this amazing Darwin Day talk. Happy Darwin Day, everyone. Darwin Day is technically on Friday, but we can start celebrating early. A few announcements. We will also have a regular Zoom reception afterwards, starting at 4:15. I will go ahead and send the link for that in the chat in just a moment, and you're welcome to join us. And that's where you can actually talk person to person. Everyone can see each other. So sort of getting out of the webinar format. I also wanted to mention that the Spring 2021 EVOS Book Club will be reading Live Long and Evolve, What Star Trek Can Teach Us About Evolution, Genetics, and Life on Other Worlds by Dr. Mohammed Noor, the Dean of Natural Sciences and a professor in the biology department at Duke University. And he will also be joining us for a Q&A on May 19th. Of this year. I'll go ahead and send the form for anyone who's interested in that as well. But I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Antonis Rokas, the director of the Evolution Initiative, who will be introducing our speaker today.
Thank you so much, Larissa, and thank you all for joining us. It's great to see so many people joining in the talk. And so on February 12th, this Friday, we will be celebrating Darwin's 212th birthday. He was born on the same day and year as Lincoln. And so that was a good day for humanity, I think. And it's become a tradition for evolutionary biologists around the world to hold all kinds of celebratory events that recognize evolution's importance to understanding our own species, our place in the universe, or how to deal with the ongoing pandemic for that matter. And so as part of these celebrations, I couldn't be more thrilled to digitally welcome Sean Carroll, who is at the helm of the Department of Science Education at Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And he's also the Balo-Simon Professor of Biology at the University of Maryland. Sean has done pioneering work in understanding the evolution of animal development. He's a prolific writer of really wonderful books. And in the last few years, he's also become a prolific film producer of really wonderful science documentaries. He has won many awards, including the Stephen Jay Gould Prize for the Advancement of Public Understanding of Evolution from the Society for the Study of Evolution, and 2 Emmys for his filmmaking abilities. I had the good fortune back in the time where both of us were much, much younger to work with him in his lab. And what I greatly appreciated beyond the terrific mentorship and great science that I got to do in his lab is that his lab had lots of fun doing science. And I think today you're in for a treat and lots of fun as we deal with sort of a topic that I think it's at the heart of our lives, chance. And so Sean will tell us about his latest book, A Series of Fortunate Events, which was a lot of fun to read. I highly recommend it. And so I'll stop here, and Sean, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Antonis. Hey, Vanderbilt. It's nice to be back, at least virtually. Wish I could be there in person. As Antonis mentioned, we worked together in the early 2000s. It was terrific. I think Antonis taught me. That was definitely the direction of the mentorship there. So today I'm going to share a few stories from my new book that ask the questions, why is the world the way it is? How did we get here? Does everything happen for a reason? Or are some things left to chance? Now, philosophers and theologians have pondered these questions for millennia. And modern philosophers still do. But nothing puts those beliefs to the test like trauma or a close call. In 2001, Seth MacFarlane was the 27-year-old creator and executive producer of the not yet hit Family Guy. And having made a splash at such a young age, he was invited back to his alma mater in Rhode Island to give a talk. And he tells the rest of his story to Piers Morgan.
A combination of two things. I was giving a lecture at my college the night before and went out with some of the faculty afterwards and had a few pints. And
You got drunk.
yes, and coupled with the fact that my travel agent had listed the flight on my itinerary as leaving 10 minutes later than it did. And I was generally late for flights. I had missed a lot of flights prior to that, so it wasn't like it was anything crazily out of the ordinary. But I got to the counter and I said, yeah, I'm booked on flight 11. And the one behind the counter said, I'm sorry, you're too late. They just closed the gate. And I said, all right, well, I'll take the 11 o'clock. Went into the lounge, fell asleep, woke up about 45 minutes later to a commotion, and the first plane had hit, and sat there and watched the second plane hit, and they announced what flight it was. And I turned to the guy next to me and said, my God, that was the flight I was supposed to be on. I was late. I missed it.
It turns out MacFarlane was not the only celebrity to miss American Flight 11. Actor Mark Wahlberg was also scheduled to be on the flight, but had changed his plans a few days later. Now, 11 years later, MacFarlane and Wahlberg teamed up to make the movie Ted. So what are the odds that these two guys would both miss Flight 11 and later make a hit movie? Were their escapes from mass murder just dumb luck? Or were their lives spared so that our lives could be enriched by a trash-talking teddy bear?
Michelob Ultra Tuscan Orange Grapefruit. My God, America is imploding.
So dumb luck, accident, chance, call it what you will. But MacFarlane's late arrival to the airport was purely an accident, albeit an accident with profound personal consequences. What a difference just 30 minutes can make. It's sobering to think what a thin line there can be between life and death. And what governs that line is a major focus of my new book. Over the past 50 years, as scientists have learned much more about the history and workings of the planet, we've been startled to discover how the course of life has been buffeted by a variety of cosmological and geological accidents, without which we would not be here. And as we've probed human biology and the factors that impact our individual lives, we've caught chance red-handed, reigning over that line between life and death. Today, I'm going to highlight a few of those events that reveal just how much we live in a chance-driven world, and then briefly explore what that means for how we think about ourselves. So speaking of thin lines, that's exactly what puzzled a geologist working near the town of Gubeo, Italy in the 1970s. Just outside this lovely medieval town, geologist Walter Alvarez saw an interesting pattern in a column of rock very close to the road. He noticed that in one section of rock, among these many layers of limestone, this beautiful stack of limestone, there's a switch in color from white below to red above. And when Alvarez looked closer, he saw that there was a peculiar grayish, greenish layer of clay separating the two colors of rock, where the coin is over here on the right. Alvarez's description of that 1 centimeter thin line began to tell the story of the most important day on Earth in the last 100 million years. A day that was very, very unlucky for most everything alive, but would eventually turn out to be extremely fortunate for us. And on that day, a long, long time ago, 30 minutes would make all the difference. The Gubeo rock formation was once part of an ancient seabed, so it contained the fossilized shells of tiny creatures called foraminifera, or forams for short. These are abundant single-celled organisms that are part of the ocean's plankton community and food web. And when forams die, their shells settle in ocean sediments and form parts of limestones that can then be pushed up by tectonic forces as they are in Italy. When Alvarez looked closely at the forams from the rock cut outside Gubeo, he saw that the white layer of rocks contained a diverse array of large fossil forams. But the reddish layer of rock just above it lacked those species and contained only a few much smaller species of forams. And that thin layer of clay in between, well, appeared to lack fossils altogether. So Alvarez realized that something dramatic had happened in the ocean that had driven many foram species extinct in a very short period of time. Now that boundary outside Gubeo, it was also known from terrestrial deposits, like this one in Western North America. And this boundary line, marked by this pocket knife, it's a dividing line between two worlds 66 million years ago. Below the boundary lay the rocks of the Cretaceous period, which makes up the last third of the age of reptiles when dinosaurs ruled the land. Above the boundary lay rocks of the Paleogene, which contain no dinosaurs, but mark the beginning of the age of mammals, when furry animals emerged to become the largest animals on land and in the seas. Alvarez and his colleagues wondered, what on earth could have caused the disappearance of widespread tiny organisms like forams, as well as much larger creatures like dinosaurs? Well, as you most likely have heard, it wasn't something on Earth, but something from space. An asteroid 6 miles wide, traveling approximately 50,000 miles per hour, slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula. And the enormous mass of rock blasted out of the crater was hurled in all directions. A thick curtain of ejecta traveling at several thousand miles per hour rained down across parts of North America, while the impact plume, which consisted of superheated air, carbon dioxide, water and sulfur vapor, vaporized rock, chunks of target rock, shot ejecta at velocities greater than Earth's escape velocity, more than 25,000 miles per hour, into and beyond the atmosphere, which then fell back down across the globe as trillions of red-hot meteors. The result? Well, the result was hell on Earth. The falling ejecta heated the air to 400 to 600 degrees Fahrenheit, triggering global wildfires and suffocating a lot of life on the surface. The impact plume and soot from the wildfires blocked out the sun. Global temperatures dropped at least 20 degrees Fahrenheit on average, probably much more. Food chains collapsed, and that blackout lasted at least a decade, perhaps as long as 30 years. And during that time and afterwards, 3/4 of all plant and animal species, including the great dinosaurs, went extinct. But the asteroid impact is the mother of all accidents, because it turns out it took some special circumstances for this mass extinction to happen. We now appreciate that the destructive power of the plume depended upon the mineral content of the rocks at the impact site. And geologists figured that only 1 to 13% of the Earth's surface contains the right kinds of rocks to trigger a mass extinction when vaporized. And so what does that mean is that with the Earth rotating at 1,000 miles per hour, this asteroid that had been circulating the solar system for perhaps 4 billion years, had it entered the Earth's atmosphere just 30 minutes earlier, it lands in the Atlantic. 30 minutes later, it lands in the Pacific. And in either case, the dinosaurs might still well be here, and we would not be. And of course, there would be no Ted, and God forbid, no Ted 2. Now let me show you another collision. This one's a little more personal. In this clip, the collision at the upper right also triggers a shower of chemicals, but this time life does not end, it begins, because this is the moment of fertilization. The trembling and shower are part of the sequence of dramatic physical and chemical changes that occur in the egg that prevent fertilization by other sperm and begin the process of embryonic development. Out of a swarm of 100 million or more contenders, only a single lucky sperm will swim all the way up the fallopian tube and successfully fertilize the egg. The fertilized egg then is the union of two genomes, half of its chromosomes from the sperm and half from the unfertilized egg. And here's an astounding fact. No two fertilized human eggs will ever be the same. That's right, ever be the same. And to see why, let's try a little pop quiz. Okay, ready? I know no one told you there's going to be a quiz, but play along. Okay. So by each contributing 23 chromosomes, how many genetically unique children could your parents have? All right, think about that. 23 chromosomes each. How many unique children? What do you think? Maybe 23? 23 plus 3, maybe 46? Or maybe, sorry, 92? No. Try 70 trillion. That's right, 70 trillion, which means each of us, each one of us, is a 1 in 70 trillion event just in our own families. And what that means is that fertilization is the accident of all mothers. And to see why, here's the math that gets you to the 70 trillion. So the number of possible chromosome combinations coming from dad, well, that depends upon the fact dad has 23 sets of chromosomes and 2 alternatives of each chromosome. And the number of different possible chromosomes is 2 to the 23rd power, or 8,388,688 chromosomes from dad. The same number of possible combinations from mom, but the number of possible combinations of sperm and egg is the product of those two numbers, which gives you 70,368,744,177,664 unique children. So after my arrival at 10 pounds, 5 ounces, my mom stopped at 4. But this enormous number, the geneticists in the audience will tell you quite quickly, is actually an underestimate because of at least 2 other phenomena, one of which I'll talk about today. And one of those contributors is mistakes. I'm talking about the copying of DNA, 6 billion letters in you and I. I mean, heck, it's so easy to make mistakes in much shorter lines of text. Let me show you a couple of my favorite examples. So I grew up as a kid in Toledo, Ohio, as a passionate baseball fan. And every morning I would read the morning newspaper to check out the box scores and look at the batting averages of my favorite players. Yeah, I know, I needed other hobbies. And one morning I read this story in the Toledo Times about an exhibition game played by the Detroit Tigers. There are 3 mistakes in this very short article. See if you can spot them all. Okay, you ready? So here's the first one. Here's the second one. And here's the third one. I don't know what's more pathetic, the fact that I noticed this or that I saved this for almost 50 years. But I don't think these were intentional. They're just random mistakes. Here's another howler from a slightly higher authority than the Toledo Times. I'm showing you a snippet from the 1631 version of the King James Bible, and I'm drawing your attention to the Seventh Commandment. I think this is the version of the Bible that's been in the White House for quite a long time. Now, this blasphemy was not detected for a year, and King Charles I was quite upset. He ordered that all copies be burned. He revoked a printer's license, one of whom died in debtor's prison. So what a difference a single letter or word can make. The same is true in life's alphabet. And let me show you a rather profound example of that. So I'm going to show you a little snippet of genetic text. This is actually not the DNA text, but the translated single letter code, amino acid code, of a little snippet of text shown on this line. And one small change, changing that middle M to R, has killed more than 33 million people. Now, how can such a small change be so deadly? I'll get to that in a few minutes. But the crux of the matter today is the cause of that change. And that leads us to the DNA molecule. Now, this is the molecule. This is the structure that was first deciphered by Watson and Crick in 1953. And the key leap, the key breakthrough in deciphering the structure of DNA was the discovery of the rules for the pairing of bases G with C, A with T, located on the opposing strands of the double helix, which actually holds the double helix together. Now, a footnote to that discovery is actually of central importance to my discussion today. Fair warning to those of you who aren't chemistry fans. I'm going to talk a little chemistry because the details are so revelatory, but don't worry, you're going to get the gist of it. Okay. So it turns out the two bases occur in two chemical forms, or tautomers, that differ only by the position of one hydrogen atom on the larger ring. So if you see this upper form here of the base G of guanine, you see that there's no hydrogen bound to this oxygen, whereas in the alternative form down here, there is a hydrogen. Similarly, while up here, there's a hydrogen bound to this nitrogen, in the alternative form, there's not a hydrogen there. The hydrogen's up there. Okay. So it turns out that Watson first worked with this form. This is the only structure he knew. And until a colleague told him in the lab that that was the rare form and that the other form, known as the keto form, was the more common form, Watson had been stumped. So once he was straightened out, turns out history was made. But the important detail here is that because this different position of the hydrogen atom, these two forms of this same base form bonds with different bases. This keto form bonds with C, with cytosine, the enol form with T, with thymine. And you might say, so what? Well, only very recently has it been possible to capture and measure the transition between the two forms of the bases, and that reveals something really important. The enol form, the rare form, is fleeting. It lasts only about 1/1000th of a second before flipping back to the keto form. So it's that hydrogen is bouncing back and forth, enol form, enol form, but the enol form lasts a very short period of time. And why does that matter? Well, that matters because if that transition takes place when the DNA is open and the copying machinery is passing by, which can pass, for example, at 1000 bases per second, as it's copying the DNA. If it happens by chance to pass when the enol form is present, then the wrong base is inserted, creating a mutation. This is the fundamental mechanism of a base mutation, of a point mutation, really captured in its sort of physical essence only very recently and published in the literature. So it tells us that this mutation is a matter of chance. More broadly, it tells us that the event at the root of mutation is an inescapable fundamental matter of physics, a quantum transition between chemical states, a chance shapeshift at the atomic level. And what does that tell us? That tells us that mutation is a feature, not a bug in DNA. We have this kind of negative connotation about mutation, but no. In every organism, in every cell, whenever DNA is copied, changes will occur because of the intrinsic characteristics of the very bases that endow DNA with its properties. Mutation, change, evolution is unavoidable and inevitable. And therefore, because every species' DNA is different and changed in this way, every individual's DNA is different because of this mechanism. It tells us that chance is the source of all innovation, all beauty, all diversity in the living world. Kind of hard to imagine, isn't it? Well, let me show you how chance invents. It's quite a big story to talk about all of the biosphere, et cetera. So let me just focus on one example and get a load of this beauty. Okay, the important thing about the eel pout is not how it looks, but where it lives. It lives in waters that are about minus 1.8 degrees Celsius. It lives in the Southern Ocean off the continent of Antarctica. Now, the main enemy of fish in these waters is not so much the cold, but it's ice. The water contains small ice crystals that, should they enter the fish through its gills or get swallowed, they would nucleate the formation of larger ice crystals and bam, they're fish sticks. So it would freeze the animals were it not for a key invention, And that key invention is antifreeze. Eel pout blood does not freeze until it reaches about minus 2.1 degrees Celsius, colder than the surrounding ocean water. And the reason being that it is chock full of proteins that work as antifreeze. The antifreeze protein binds to microscopic ice crystals and prevents their ability to grow into larger crystals. Now, the really neat part of this story is that we can track the origin of the genetic code for the antifreeze. We have a forensic trail of how this invention arose, and it shows how chance mutation is an inventor. And we know this because of some great expert sleuthing through the DNA of eel pouts and other fish. And the key clue came when it was noticed that the antifreeze protein bore a remarkable resemblance to a section of another protein found in other fish. The protein's an enzyme called SAS. It's involved in making a sugar. We don't really care about that today. The important thing is notice that the tail end of the SAS protein and the antifreeze protein were remarkably similar. And the reason for the strong resemblance, as it turns out, is that the antifreeze evolved from SAS. The detective work revealed that a mutation removed sort of the core of this SAS gene, just leaving behind this tail piece, which had some intrinsic ice-binding activity. And that was the genesis of the first antifreeze gene. The eel pout's ancestors then ran, or rather swam with this invention, and they actually multiplied this gene many times over and expanded antifreeze gene number to more than 30 copies, which enables the fish to make a lot more antifreeze. These antifreeze genes, they're arrayed next door to each other in a tandem arrangement on a chromosome in the DNA. This tandem arrangement also tells us that another well-known mutational mechanism that duplicates genes or blocks of genes happened that built up this battery of antifreeze so that the fish make a lot of antifreeze. Now, I could show you many more examples of the creativity of mutations. I'll spare you. And I'm going to let this one make the point that mutation, thus chance, is the inventor. And what that means is, as you look around the world, we live in a world of mistakes generated by chance. The entire living diversity of the biosphere, a product of chance mutation. So chance mutation is the innovator. Genetic accidents occur at random. They change genes without regard to potential circumstances, or potential consequences, I mean. The fate of the mutation depends on external circumstances. In a sieving process we call natural selection. So what determines those circumstances? Well, let's look at the eel pout example, okay? So again, think about it. Mutation, this random process, creating variety, creating change. But the fate of that mutation depends upon external circumstances. And the most relevant external circumstances to the eel pout is this very cold ocean. So then we want to ask, how and why did the Antarctic Ocean get so cold? And at a first level, the answer is tectonics. So you may be aware, and oh my God, one of my hosts is a geologist, so I'm about to screw this up. Sorry, Larissa. That you may know that the continents and oceans are sitting on tectonic plates that move around quite slowly and have been moving around for eons. So they're in different positions today than they were in the past. Well, with respect to the freezing over the Antarctic, there's two tectonic events that are of most interest. And that has to do with the separation of South America from Antarctica and the position of the Asian subcontinent. So 65 million years ago, for example, when after that asteroid impact happened, the Indian subcontinent was actually below the equator, near the level of Madagascar. And South America and Antarctica were joined. But subsequently, the Indian subcontinent moved north, actually fairly rapidly as tectonic plates go, slammed into Asia, built the Himalaya, and that caused global change in climate that led to the glaciation of the Antarctic. And then as South America and Antarctica separated, that isolated the waters around the Southern Ocean, leading to currents that were much more isolated and colder, and plunged the temperature to below the freezing temperature of fresh water. Okay, So these plate movements have a lot to do with the environment of the Southern Ocean. And then you would ask, well, why did these plates move in the way that they did? Okay, well, there's been some exploration of tectonic plates. And what we understand is that it seems that plate movement depends upon a few factors: the size of the plate, the shape of the plate, and the thickness of the plate as a determinant, particularly in the speed at which they move. And I mentioned the Indian subcontinent moved rather quickly, much faster than the other plates over the last 60 million years. So you might say, well, why did it move so fast? Well, it turns out that the Indian subcontinent, the other continents, were part of a supercontinent called Gondwanaland 140 million years ago, which broke up, started moving around, and the pieces started moving around the globe. It broke into many pieces. And what determined the size and shape and thickness of those pieces, well, as far as we can tell, it's just like breaking a plate when you drop it on the kitchen floor. It broke up into random pieces. Chance. So what that tells us with respect to the story of the eel pout, and in general, is that chance invents this internal process based on random mutation, and the fate of that invention depends upon circumstances, external circumstances, shaped by chance. Okay, so we're a long, long way from Providence, and I don't mean the capital of Rhode Island. It's astonishing that blind chance is the source of all novelty, all diversity, all beauty in the biosphere. And I hope you're awestruck at what an asteroid, sliding tectonic plates, and a flickering polymer of just 4 bases have wrought. But our chance-driven existence also poses the unsettling quandary that we don't live in the best of all possible worlds, just our world. And this view, of course, it challenges traditional beliefs about cause and effect in the world. And those beliefs are represented, I think, for example, by this book and quote by theologian R.C. Sproul, who categorically rejects the existence of chance in his book, Not a Chance, The Myth of Chance in Modern Science and Cosmology. Sproul writes, "It's not necessary for chance to rule in order to supplant God. Indeed, chance requires little authority at all if it is to depose God. All it needs to do the job is to exist. The mere existence of chance is enough to rip God from his cosmic throne. Chance does not need to rule, does not need to be sovereign. If it exists as a mere impotent, humble servant, it leaves God not only out of date, but out of a job." All right, so according to Sproul, chance puts God out of a job, or at least many of the jobs we've traditionally assigned to him or her. God's not in the conception business choosing the winning sperm and egg, nor the genetic engineering business designing creatures' DNA and traits. Chance will do that just fine. Nor the weather making business, nor the cancer business, nor, as it turns out, the pandemic business. So remember, a few minutes ago, I talked about what a difference one typo can make. Well, now I'll reveal to you where those texts come from that I was highlighting. That original text, that short little thing, is a piece of the code for the simian immunodeficiency virus, a virus that, for example, infects chimpanzees. And the second line is the corresponding part of the human immunodeficiency virus, the HIV virus responsible for AIDS. And the mutation I highlighted, that M to R in the middle of this section of the protein, it enables the chimpanzee virus to infect human cells, which has occurred by accident at least 3 separate times and triggered the AIDS pandemic. What a difference a typo can make. Okay, so if not theologians, who do we turn to think about chance and its implications? Well, I choose novelist Kurt Vonnegut. Vonnegut wrote a lot about sort of our accidental existence and our search for meaning. And in one book in particular, I was struck by a story that he told. It's a semi-autobiographical book, Slapstick. And he opens the book by talking about how he and his brother Bernard went to visit his sister Alice, who was dying of cancer at the age of 41. And they visited her on what turned out to be her last day of life. And Vonnegut explains, Hers would have been an unremarkable death statistically if it were not for one detail, which is this. Her healthy husband, James Carmel Adams, the editor of a trade journal for purchasing agents, which he put together in a cubicle on Wall Street, had died 2 mornings before on the Broker's Special, the only train in American railroading history to hurl itself off an open drawbridge. Think of that. This really happened. Now, Vonnegut concocted all sorts of fantastic scenarios in his novels, but this really did happen. A New Jersey commuter train went through all sorts of signals off an open drawbridge and killed almost 60 people. Now, Bernard and Vonnegut were not going to tell his sister about this because she was already concerned about the fate of her 4 children who were going to be left in the hands of her husband. But as it turns out, another patient showed Alice the newspaper. She read the list of victims and saw her husband there. Her reaction? Vonnegut writes, since Alice had never received any religious instruction, and since she had led a blameless life, she never thought of her awful luck as being anything but accidents in a very busy place. Good for her. Accidents in a very busy place indeed. I've only told you a few snippets today, but we now know that we are all here, both collectively and individually, through a series of accidents, cosmological, geological, and biological accidents. Vonnegut's books helped me to realize that next to scientists, the one group of people that seem least inclined to think that everything happens for a reason, and rather that blind chance governs the world, are humorists and comedians. So many great present day comedians, Seth MacFarlane, Eddie Izzard, Eric Idle, Bill Maher, Ricky Gervais, Sarah Silverman, many more. Late greats from Mark Twain to Vonnegut to George Carlin have rejected traditional beliefs about cause and effect in the world. So many of my favorite and very funny people. In fact, it made me wonder, why is this so? What do scientists and comedians have in common? So I actually reached out to several to ask them, and some took the time to reply. And I'll leave that conversation for those of you who want to read the book. But I'm going to close today on 2 pearls of wisdom from 2 comedians that seem especially apt for these times that we are all experiencing. The first comes from Ricky Gervais, who told 60 Minutes, it always comes back to us. Why are we here? Well, we just happen to be here. We couldn't choose it. We're not special. We're just lucky. And this is a holiday. We didn't exist for 14.5 billion years. Then we got 80 or 90 years if we're lucky, and then we'll never exist again. So we should make the most of it. Now, of course, when bad things happen, we all struggle. How can we cope? Well, I think Eric Idle has the best answer.
When you do find yourself in a kind of a dark place like that, something going wrong, I mean, how do you deal with difficult stuff like that, Eric?
Well, philosophy really helps. I mean, there's some things in life are bad. They can really make you mad. Other things just make you swear and curse. When you're chewing on life's gristle, don't grumble. Give a whistle. And this'll help things turn out for the best. And always look on the bright side of life. Always look on the right side of life. Life is jolly rotten. There's something you forgot. And that's to laugh and smile and dance and sing. When you're feeling in the dumps, don't be silly chumps. Just purse your lips and whistle, that's the thing. And always look on the bright side of life. Always look on the light side of life. For life is quite absurd, and death's the final word. You must always face the curtain with a bow. Forget about your sin, give the audience a grin. Enjoy it, it's your last chance anyhow. So Always look on the bright side of death. Just before you draw your terminal breath. Life's a piece of shit when you look at it. Life's a laugh and death's a joke, it's true. You'll see it's all a show. Keep them laughing as you go. Just remember that the last laugh is on you. And always look on the bright side of life. Always look on the bright side of life. Come on, give me louder. A key change, here we go. Always look on the bright side of life. Very good. Always look on the bright side of life. What have you got to lose? You come from nothing. You're going straight to nothing. What have you lost? Nothing. And always look on the bright side of life.
So I have to give special credit to Eric Idle, who was one of the comedians who kindly answered my questions with, of course, great sense of humor. So thanks everybody for listening. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Sean, for a wonderful talk. We already have a few questions in the Q&A, and for those of you who have more questions, feel free to type them in. So let's start with the first one. What accidental typo resulted in SARS-CoV-2, the virus that's given rise to the pandemic? So can you speak more generally about the role of chance in the emergence of the pandemic, or in the emergence of the
it's a great question, and you may know that a WHO team was just in Wuhan, China, trying to ask this question, because there are two possibilities. Well, there are many biological possibilities, but there was unfortunately another possibility, which was this was a lab release, and the team has uttered the opinion that that's not what happened. So then we have to think about what happened in nature. Well, I think what we have to picture is that there are, there's huge population, there's several thousand species of mammals out there alone, and there's all sorts of viruses in those mammals that are randomly mutating, and that the chances when we encounter this wildlife, for example, in a cave somewhere, or maybe in a meat market when it's being butchered, that there's a chance for that virus to get into the human population. And we think that's what happened with AIDS, probably maybe back in the 19-teens or 20s, that the butchery of a chimpanzee or something like that was exposed humans to their blood, and perhaps how HIV got in. In this case, we know that the virus that SARS-CoV-2 is closest to is a virus we found in a bat, but it's still pretty distant from that particular bat virus. So we don't have kind of the smoking source, immediate source of SARS-CoV-2. SARS is thought to have been passed at a market through palm civets. So you may know about the SARS outbreak. And MERS, which is also a coronavirus, is passed by camels. So we know about some mammalian hosts that have been the source of spillover events into the human population, but we don't have it nailed for SARS-CoV-2. When we do find that source, we'd like to know what genetic changes happen. And we don't know whether it would be something slight, like a little change in the receptor protein that would allow it to infect cells, or it could have been some recombination between coronaviruses and sort of mix in a little larger scale genetic rearrangement. But in terms of the role of accident, you can think it's at several levels. It's these randomly mutating viruses out in wild populations. It's their encounter with humans, and even that first human that gets infected, did that, that human had a chance to pass it on. In other cases, we know of some other instances, in fact, some cases that were studied in China, where there may have been an exposure of a pretty nasty coronavirus in a mine, I think. But it affected like 3 out of 6 people that were exposed, and then there was no further spread. So lots of things had to happen in a particular way that this would spread, not just in Wuhan, but of course it happened to hit right before the Chinese New Year, when millions of people then went and traveled and spread this across the globe. But in terms of genetic accidents, it's still of extremely keen interest to understand just how much change had to happen in a coronavirus to let loose what we've all experienced.
Thank you. Another question is about the antifreeze gene, and it says, but a human would never make an antifreeze gene, right? So even though Chance is the inventor of the antifreeze gene, Chance seems to be taking into consideration what random mutations might be beneficial for the eel pout.
Well, we got to step a little carefully here. First of all, having lived in Wisconsin, as Antonis did as well, I think maybe humans might need an antifreeze gene. But the mutation, for example, the mutation of that SAS gene that created something that had some antifreeze activity, that's an accident. It could still happen. It could happen in a human. We have the gene. But would that mutation be propagated at all? Well, that requires this process of natural selection. It requires some performance difference in the offspring of those individuals that would actually increase the frequency of that mutation in a population. So remember, the mutation's happening without any consideration of potential consequences. What the fate of that mutation depends upon these circumstances of whether or not that mutation will be favored. So there's no conjuring up of the necessary mutations. The mutations are just the random changing and reassortment of genetic information, some of which happen to be fortuitous and give some performance advantage to the individuals possessing it.
Perfect, thank you. Your presentation made me think back of Chance and Necessity, written in 1970 by Monod, of course. Is it what triggered my, it is what triggered my fascination to biology. Is it worth to go back and revisit that perspective developed right after the discovery of the genetic code?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Antonis knows that I'm going to run with this one for a little while. Yeah, there's no accident that I wrote a book on Chance, which it is somewhat an accident that it appeared 50 years to the month after Chance and Necessity. So like you, I read Chance and Necessity early on as a biologist. It made quite an impression on me. And in 2013, I published a book. I spent several years researching Monod's life and his friendship, in fact, with the writer Albert Camus, and wrote a book called Brave Genius in 2013. And I've been fortunate to develop a friendship with the Monod family and to delve deeply into Monod's life and his archive and understand a little bit of the genesis of his own thinking. So you're absolutely right that this book is, I don't know if it's even proper to call it kind of an heir to Chance and Necessity, but I realized that 50 years later, there's things that I can talk about that Jacques Monod couldn't. In 1970, he could pretty much assert that mutation was random, but that was really from arguments from formal genetics. We didn't have the ability to sequence DNA. We didn't know anything about asteroid impacts. We didn't know anything about, for example, the chaotic climate cycles of the ice ages. We hadn't captured, for example, the fundamental basis of mutation. So I thought it would be good to revisit this. And also, Jacques died 6 years after Chance and Necessity. And while the book was quite a sensation, it was #2 on the bestseller list in France, only to a translation of Love Story. Okay, this is France after all; they have their priorities. It was pretty heavily covered here. And Jacques had a lot of debates with theologians and philosophers and things like this. And my sense was that this discussion about chance kind of has faded out a little bit. And I thought that both in the scientific community, especially in sort of the teaching community, that we should resurface these ideas a little bit more, because I think chance is a very powerful concept that sort of runs counter to a lot of sort of, I think, human intuition and desires. But nonetheless, that's what it is. So yeah, I owe a huge debt to Chance and Necessity. I owe a huge debt to Jacques Monod, and I happen to have been lucky enough to sort of live in Monod's, at least in his archive, for several years. So thanks for the question.
Thank you. We have a series of questions that are sort of on the same topics. I'll try to weave them together. So one question is about how does your work inform how you live your life? And the other is, how do we think about free will if chance is so dominant? Are we just a bunch of molecules bumping around? And a third question that's related is, so much of human activity has been devoted to removing elements of chance from our lives, right? So if you think about agriculture or democracy, all these are efforts to make our environment more stable, more predictable, more well-functioning.
Yeah.
And so how do you think of this, and you know, how
It's a great spectrum of questions, and I'm thinking, okay, how do I answer this without going on some kind of sermon? How does it influence my own life? Look, I think that I've tried to embrace chance the best I can, and look, there's two sides of it, right? There's sort of the awe and the joy of I think about that asteroid a lot. I got to tell you, and to me, I've had the chance to maybe go to 4 or 5 places in the world, and just put my finger right on that boundary, and it's a spine tingling experience for me, because I'm thinking that's when the world changed, and had this change not happened, mammals are probably still an insignificant part of the biota, and we're not having this conversation. So I just find that, I don't know, almost, it's thrilling. It's absolutely thrilling to me. And then at these other levels, when I think about human biology, and I think about chromosomes and whatever genetic combination begat me or my kids, there's a bit of delight in there. But of course, there's a dark side to chance. It's pandemics, it's cancer and things like that. And of course, these things affect my life as much as they do everybody else's. And that's a harder thing to sort of manage. So I'd like to say that I've embraced chance, and some parts of it I find really thrilling. And I think it wouldn't be too surprising to you. I find it somewhat liberating from other ideas that I don't think carry much power of explanation about, how we got here. In terms of free will, I guess, I'm just not that deep a thinker. I sort of think we still have free will. You decided to come to this seminar, you poor people. Yes, we are just matter, but at the same time, we do have intention. We do have free will. So I don't think I take a lot of that away from us. I think we just understand that this whole nature nurture sort of biology and determinism, look, fortunately, this organ up here has given us a lot more freedom than just our DNA encodes, and culture as well. And I think it's just a great point that the questioner is making about how human activity has been devoted to removing chance, from growing crops so that we're not subject to the whims of climate as much, to obviously vaccinating so that we're not as vulnerable to germs. And look how that's shown up in terms of at least the quantity of life, the quantity of human life. Obviously, we're a massive part now of the biosphere, but also the quantity of individual human life. So yeah, we are trying to take chance out of the equation. I mean, we're even thinking about how to deflect asteroids, should they come at us. A thought that we wouldn't have had 50 years ago until we discovered that there was, in fact, the possibility of an Earth-changing asteroid coming at us. So I think it's a really interesting observation that we're trying to do everything to increase sort of stability, security, predictability of the future. But of course, we only go so far, because some of the challenges we're facing about the future of the biosphere, it's been a little harder to gather humanity sort of on the same page there.
Perfect. Thank you. The discussion begs the question of consciousness. Any thoughts on chance and consciousness?
I think I'm so disappointingly shallow. So consciousness to me is, is our awareness of our existence and these kinds of thoughts. And I think, it definitely interested Minot. I would refer you to Chance and Necessity, which is a more philosophical treatment than you just got in the last 40 minutes. And, just pondering how did, of all the creatures on the planet, we wind up with this sort of perspective on our mortality and, conscious of our existence, conscious of our demise. So I don't know where to place chance in there, except to think that, somewhere, and I do tell this story in a chapter in the book, and I skipped over it here in the talk, but I'm also thrilled by the account that paleoanthropologists have given us, which is, this big brain evolved very rapidly. It grew very rapidly during the ice ages, when the climate that our hominid ancestors were experiencing was incredibly volatile. Not so much hot and cold or warm and cold as it is at the poles, but wet and dry in, for example, East Africa. And it's pretty clear from the tool record, et cetera, that we did a bit better than other mammals. And we went through this dramatic transformation in brain size. And of course, we became this creature that could control its habitat, control its environment with, fire, clothing, obviously language and everything else. And, learned our way around where we remembered obviously remember where the fruits and the nuts and everything else are. We've got quite a mental map making device up here. So I'm again thrilled by the narrative that, and ice ages are very unusual. The last 2 million years is a really weird period for Earth. It's the first ice age in 300 million years. And so this very volatile climate is a driver of essentially our evolution. So I would say, think of all how plate tectonics led to the cooling of the Earth, which leads to the ice ages, which leads to us. And that's kind of like the slow version of the asteroid story leading to us. So when I think about consciousness, I sort of think that, it's a byproduct of our overly large brains.
Thank you.
Sorry, there's a lot better books than the garbage I just threw out there.
So what do you think about Oparin's primordial soup theory and I guess the role of chance in the origins of life?
Yeah, well, origin of life is a hugely important subject, but I think biologists would largely admit it's still a pretty big black box. I think we've gathered some interesting ideas over the decades and maybe refined them with the idea of self-replicating molecules and all that, but we're still pretty clueless. I mean, nobody can argue that even life started on Earth, could have come from somewhere else. We don't know how prevalent life is in the universe. Most people I talk to about this, who are serious about it, believe that life is widespread, at least of sort of a microbial grade. If that's correct, then that says sort of the chemical conditions for life, could be widespread. So whatever, Oparin or other early experiments, sort of the lightning chamber experiments on life, they're all very interesting because, the idea that it just doesn't seem that complicated to get the building blocks of, polymers and important biological molecules. And we know the abundance of some of these things, on other bodies. So I think the great question that some group of scientists are going to enjoy somewhere, and I'd like to see it before I'm gone, is a more definitive feel of life in the universe. And I think if we get the sense that life in the universe is widespread, that will really inform our thoughts about, just how unique or not is the story on Earth. I don't think we necessarily have dinosaurs and butterflies on other planets, but I certainly think that life is extremely likely.
Perfect. Thank you. One final question. I'm curious about what made you want to write and talk about chance in this positive, rich way. They think it's so great, but what motivated you? What made you think chance is so great?
Well, I guess I've used the word thrilling. I for some reason, my reaction to the idea that but for things going a different way, we wouldn't be here. That's an origin story that I wanted to understand. As I said, I've had the chance, as Antonis knows, I'm an indoor biologist. Okay. So, but, have only later in life had a chance for a few patient paleontologists to walk me out into the wilds and point me to the right place and teach me some of these things. And I've just found them so enriching, so enlarging sort of my perspective. And I think that embracing chance really helps us kind of manage our thoughts about the living world and the universe that we're in, in a constructive way. And just all these discoveries that have happened, I think it's great that we have some kind of framework to put them together in, as opposed to them just being, oh, whatever, that was, an asteroid, that was weird. No, that was profound. Without it, we're not having this conversation. So I guess I hoped in structuring this book, so I'll give away a couple of, little secrets, and maybe it's reflected in the talk, which is, I didn't want to go back to the origin of the universe. Cosmologists talk about this a lot, but I sort of feel like you get kind of further and further away from sort of empirical and demonstrable. No insult there. Somebody's going to take me to task, but I'm just saying I wanted to talk about things. And really the book starts with the asteroid impact because it's only 66 million years ago. It's real tangible. We know that mammals took off after that. That record's really clear. You can see it all over the globe. 98% of the world has heard about this. And then I can go from there to other geological events and then get to sort of the internal biology. And everyone's familiar with reproduction, and everyone was, made someday, and some people have children and they can relate to chromosomes, and maybe they've thought a little bit about mutation. So I wanted to deal with what I thought was really tangible stuff, rigorously tangible stuff, that would provoke people to think about, just how many things. It's kind of a big what if story. How many things sort of had to happen in a certain way, or else collectively or individually we're not here. And I hope people feel a little bit of awe and thrill at that. Awe and thrill that that's the story, and also some awe that we've been able to figure this out in the last 50 years. When the asteroid impact hypothesis was first put forward, the scientists involved were crucified by different communities. So, and now we take it as, as settled science. So, I think even scientists' mindsets had to change with some of these phenomena. So why not the general public? So I think science has an important thing to offer in our culture, ways to reflect upon, who we are, how we got here. And of course, we haven't been living in the scientific era for very long. We have lots of ideas that have predated that for a couple thousand years that I'm not the first to say. Monod was quite strenuous about this. They don't hold up very well to new scientific discoveries. So hopefully that gives you some sense of motivation. But I think that thrill is important, the thrill of discovery and the thrill of meaning.
All right, so we're at the hour. And so I want to thank you again for a wonderful presentation and for answering all these questions. For our audience, I want to thank you for your attention. Please join us in 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes, in the Zoom reception, and the link is at the chat box. And so thank you again, and happy Darwin Day.